Hello, if you are watching this, it means you want to learn a little bit more about logical fallacies. So here we go. What are they? Logical fallacies are simply mistakes in reasoning. In other words, it's a mistake in logos. That is a logical appeal to your audience's brain or mind. They happen often because, as Jim Carrey knows, everyone makes mistakes. So don't feel bad if you make a logical fallacy in your own argument. It's actually kind of fun to read other people's arguments and try to spot their logical fallacies. But it is something you want to try to avoid as much as possible because it does undermine your credibility. So here's some basic vocabulary before we begin, because we're going to be using these two terms a lot as we go through the different examples. So a premise is the first statement in an argument. You're going to see some examples in just a bit. And the conclusion is usually the final statement or the second statement of the argument. The premise leads to the conclusion follows from the premise. Okay? So here are some of the most common logical fallacies. We'll go through them one by one, define them, and give you an example. Okay? Non sequitur, which is Latin for does not follow. This is a conclusion that does not follow from the premise or argument. Here's an example. Diane went to Stanford. She'll make a great lawyer. The premise is Diane went to Stanford. That's actually true. The conclusion is she'll make a great lawyer. That's not necessarily true based on the fact that she went to Stanford. In fact, there's probably a lot of people who went to Stanford Law School and are terrible lawyers. While there are some that are also great, but there's no guarantee that Diane's going to be great. So this is a non sequitur. Begging the question. Okay, the premise remains debatable and unproven. Remember, the premise is the first part of the argument. Here's an example. Writing papers by hand is a waste of time. We should just type all our papers. Okay? Actually, in AP language, writing your papers by hand is not a waste of time because it's actually helping you train for the AP language test itself, which requires you to write by hand. So saying that writing papers is a waste of time is a debatable or even unproven premise. Circular reasoning. The conclusion or argument restates the premise. I like to watch baseball because I enjoy sports. So these are two parts of the argument that are basically saying the same thing. You're just saying them in different words. So you're not really adding anything to your original premise, which is I like to watch baseball. Straw man. The argument exaggerates the claims made by opposition and then attacks those claims. So here's an example. Gun control opponents believe tragedies like the Newtown shooting are no big deal, just as long as gun owners get to keep bearing arms. So I think it would be a stretch to say that even gun control opponents kind of just shrugged off the Newtown shooting and thought it wasn't a big deal. They were actually probably thought it was a big deal, and so we're exaggerating their feelings about Newtown to attack them on their opinions about gun control. The ad hominem attack. You actually saw this on content quiz number 2. This is an argument that attacks an opponent's character and not the logic of their argument. Here's an example. You cannot trust abortion opponents. They're just a bunch of evangelical crackpots. So again, wrong there, by the way. That's a typo. Made this PowerPoint very quickly. But back to the logic of this argument, or the false logic of this argument. This is just attacking abortion opponents for their character and not really attacking them upon the logic of why they oppose abortion. This is just trying to make an attack. Overgeneralization, an argument that stereotypes a group of people or an idea based on limited evidence. This is very common. Teenagers in general are extremely immature and untrustworthy, so we shouldn't listen to their positions on important issues. Okay, you would not appreciate that being said about you since you're teenagers. So in general, groups of people do not like to be stereotyped or overgeneralized about. This is a extremely common logical fallacy. And then finally, the either-or fallacy. You also saw this on content quiz number 2. An argument that sets up a false choice between two options when other alternatives may exist. Here's an example. The United States has to choose between bombing Syria to uphold international justice or not bombing Syria and looking weak to the entire world. What's ironic about this example is that that was in fact the logic that the Obama administration was using in trying to argue for bombing Syria, when in fact Russia proposed a diplomatic solution that proposed another alternative. Now, whether you agree with the United States not bombing Syria is irrelevant. What I'm simply saying is that the U.S. was actually setting up an either-or logical fallacy originally to try to argue for bombing Syria. Okay, so these are the Magnificent Seven, right? These are the most common, though not all, logical fallacies you may ever encounter, but for the purposes of AP Lang, this is a good starting point. So let's look at some examples and see if you can't guess what they are. So I'm going to put up an example. I suggest that you pause, look at the example, think about it before you actually guess, and then I put the answer up here. Veterinarians discovered that several live beagles had a contagious intestinal disorder. All beagles must be infected with this disease. Pause for a second, look back if you need to, or look at your notes if you've been taking notes and see which logical fallacy you think this is. Okay, if you're back from pausing, we can go to the answer now. This is an overgeneralization, not about people this time, about beagles, but it's still kind of stereotyping a general group of things or animals based on limited evidence. Here's the next example. If you don't vote, then Governor Brown is sure to lose and the state will fall into chaos. Pause if you need to, think about it. What logical fallacy is this? If you're back from pause, okay, either you vote for Governor Brown and everything stays fine, or you don't vote for Governor Brown and everything falls into chaos. Okay, this is a typical scare tactic, which is a misuse of pathos, setting up a false choice. So this happens often very much in political discourse. Here's the next example. The American dream is an inspiration because it really motivates people. Pause, think about it, and then come back. Okay, here's the answer. Circular reasoning. I actually have seen thoughts like this a lot in your thesis statements. Okay, this is basically saying the same thing in different words. So when you say it really motivates people, that's like saying it's an inspiration. It doesn't really add too much to the original premise. So be careful about how you word your thesis and topic sentences, because I've seen sentences like this quite a bit. Here's the next example. The American dream is the one true thing that all Americans can agree on. We need to come together and keep up what our forefathers believed we could do. Stop if you need to and answer the question, and then we'll come back. Okay, here's the answer. Begging the question. That means the original premise, the first part of the statement, is unproven or debatable. When you say the American dream is the one true thing that all Americans can agree on, I think you have a lot of argument from a lot of Americans about that statement. Number one, I don't think we can agree about what the American dream is. Number two, there actually may be other things that all of us could agree on. So this premise is just full of holes, and so it's begging the question. Okay, here's the last example. The American dream works for many young immigrants who come here to find work. Therefore, we should relax our visa policy to let as many people in as possible. Pause if you need to. Think about what logical fallacy this is. Okay, coming back, here's the answer. This is a non sequitur, meaning the conclusion, the second part of the statement, does not necessarily follow from the first or the premise. Okay, so the first part of this statement is actually, or may actually be true. Many young immigrants do come here to find work. This does not necessarily mean that we should relax our visa policy so that as many people as possible can come in. This could create some security concerns. It could create a backlog in visa applications. It could really disrupt the visa application and immigration process. So the conclusion does not follow from the premise. All right, so these are the Magnificent Seven again. Again, they're mistakes, but as you can see by this GIF, everyone, every once in a while, makes mistakes. So don't feel bad, but do try to avoid these mistakes as much as possible. Thanks for watching. See you later.